So, Béa, welcome back to the channel. Today's discussion is on Pluto, and most specifically, the Pluto ingresses into the signs throughout the years, and the kinds of things that it means. As well as always, of course, when you talk about any planet, the mythology is super important, and so I'm sure that's going to come up as well. So, take it away.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again because I think you want me to be, I'll keep on track, right? So do you see my screen?
Not yet.
It? Okay, I didn't share it, that's why. Okay, give me a second. Share screen. I have to find it. I'm not. Okay, now I'm finding it, sorry. All right, here we go. You should be able to see it now, right?
Yes.
The big Pluto sign right there. We have two different symbols for Pluto. And before we actually talk about the story that I think people don't know that can be related to Pluto, because I think everybody knows the one about Pluto or Hades abducting Persephone into the underworld. That's the story that most people will link to Pluto. Let's just talk a little bit about how weird Pluto, the planet, is, right? So it's the planet that was discovered in 1930, although I think it was seen already by Claude Tombaugh in 1905. And then 1930 in Flagstaff, they actually find a picture of it located in space. So they can say, yes, this is actually a planet. But what's really weird about Pluto and makes it so interesting, and it's important to know this because it's going to make you understand, or make the person watching this understand, why Pluto spends so much time in some signs and spends so little time in other signs. And that is how crazy the orbit of Pluto is, how elliptical it is. So you see that this is the purple one is the Pluto, and you see the other orbits, which are actually quite circular. They're elliptical, but they're not so crazy. And this is due to the tilt of the planet, which is at 17 degrees. And that may not seem like a lot, but actually the tilt of the Earth towards the sun is 1.5 degrees. So this is how crazy it is. And so what happens with Pluto is that if you notice, at some point in its journey, it actually is inside the Neptune orbit. It actually travels within the Neptune orbit. It's contained by it. Right. But the really important thing to know is that when Pluto is transiting here, it takes a lot longer than when it's transiting this side, right?
That's right.
This would be Taurus, Aries, those signs, and this would be Scorpio, Libra. I think that's the places where it spends.
Correct. Yeah, because a lot of people in the 20th century, they'll reach their Pluto opposition sometimes in their 80s. Because of exactly that, because the Pluto is moving much faster than in this particular side. Yeah, it's true.
And that's important to know, because you will probably when I finish this little part of it, then you might want to talk about the Pluto Return, which is so big right now, the Pluto Return in the US chart. So the thing to understand is the actual period that it takes Pluto to do a full cycle is 248 years, plus or minus, whatever. And so that's why Pluto is returning to the place it was when, or is really now. This is the year it's doing it. Although, of course, you can talk about precession, etc. Anyway, just to give you a visual as to why Pluto is this quirky planet, now a dwarf, but of course, nobody in the astrological community thinks this is a dwarf by any means. But anyway, so I know the idea of demoting Pluto is just insane. One of the things to think about actually in the post-Saturnian planets, because I'm giving you the archetypal view of this whole thing, right, is that, and obviously I'm informed by the work of Carl Jung on this. So post-Saturnian planets, and I'm going to say Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and Eris, although we have less information about Eris, but we certainly have a lot of information about the other three. They are archetypal in that if they're connected to one of your personal planets, let's say Moon, Sun, Venus, Mercury, they really can overwhelm you. They can overwhelm that particular energy, right? They can take you over either natally, so that then that is a marker for something that happens in life, or by transit. It shows up and suddenly it activates your Venus and you start becoming obsessive or whatever, in whatever way that it manifests. And so the reason I'm saying that is that it's powers that are beyond the personal capacity for control, okay? And I think people should know this so that they understand that it's bigger it can take you over. It is massive. And the reason that I'm saying this is the story, the mythological story often associated with Pluto is the abduction of Persephone into the underworld by Hades. Pluto is brother of Zeus, and so on. There's no other story in the Greek pantheon that actually speaks about Pluto, which is interesting. But there is a story because, of course, all archetypal energies have more than one. They're multivalent in the word that Richard Tarnas likes to use a lot. So there's one more way you can look at it than the standard way. So I want to tell you about the story that I actually think of when I think of Pluto, and that one of the gods that Pluto has been also linked to, the whole planetary energy, is Dionysus, and he's known as Bacchus in the Roman view, which is, of course, the god of wine and reverie. And Nietzsche used the Dionysian spirit to the idea of letting go, being overwhelmed and taken over by forces that are beyond your control, which I think Pluto really can speak to. Okay, so there is a play from the Greek classical period by Euripides known as the Bacchae, which I think tells the whole story. And I have made a video about it, and I'll give you the link after, and if people want to see a more complete version of this. But it's a really powerful, and because it's Greek, it's also dark, and I think it really speaks to what Pluto is about. And let's start with who is Dionysus, right? And so Dionysus is the god of Semele, who is a mortal woman who's having, of course, you'll be surprised to hear this, an affair with Zeus. And Hera, the wife, gets upset as usual, so she tries to do something to the woman. It's interesting, Hera never does anything to Zeus. She always goes after whoever Zeus is getting involved with. Anyway, Hera insists or puts an idea into Semele's head that she must ask Zeus to be seen in his full glory as a god. This is a really important concept, and it's taken up by another story called Psyche and Eros, which is very, very important for understanding romantic love. She wants her to ask Zeus to do this because if Zeus shows himself in his god glory, she will be pulverized. So that's a great way to get rid of your opponent. You just basically say, oh, he's not showing himself because he's really not Zeus. He's just tricking you. So Semele keeps insisting to Zeus, please show yourself in your god form. And Zeus keeps saying, I can't do that. You will be blown up. You'll die. But she won't let go of this idea. So eventually does. And she is, in fact, pulverized. But just before she disappears or, whatever is absorbed, he grabs the baby she is carrying, that's Zeus's baby, and that's Dionysus. And he sews him into his thigh and brings him. So Dionysus is the son who comes out of Zeus's body, just like Athena comes out of his head. This one comes out of the thigh. And it's really, for me, it's really important. There's the argument about does Pluto have rulership over Scorpio? That's the modern connection. Here's my argument for Pluto-Scorpio connection. Dionysus and the thigh, right? The thigh in later mythology will be connected to the reproduction organs, to the idea of regeneration. And so this is how you can connect Pluto to Scorpio through this one myth. Anyway, to try to make a very long story as short as I can, once Semele is pulverized, he's exaltation, where he becomes a god and is recognized as Dionysus. And Thebes, where Semele came from, goes on, and eventually his cousin Pentheus becomes the ruler of Thebes, and Dionysus goes on a revenge trip, which I think is another great word for Pluto, right? He decides he is going to get revenge on behalf of his mother. So he goes back to, first he sends his followers. And the thing about Dionysus' followers is that they go mad. They basically, it's almost like being drunk in that, they start dancing and cavorting and just, they're completely out of control. So this Maenads, so that these are the ones that the Bacchus first, but anyway, the Maenads are the followers when they get to Thebes, and they start disrupting the social order. And Pentheus is really about order, like he's the cop, right? So this is part of the story too. He wants to maintain order, and all of a sudden these women are behaving completely illogical and insane, and he doesn't know what to do about it. So when Dionysus shows up and says, all you have to do is honor me as a god, and Pentheus says, no way, I'm not taking you as a god. And in fact, he jails him. And the problem is when he jails him, Dionysus is a god. So he creates an earthquake and he does all sorts of things that make it impossible for Pentheus. eventually, his revenge is really exacted on when he makes his own mother drunk. That is agave. Think about where tequila comes from. So agave, mother of Pentheus, right? He makes sure that she's the one that goes under his, and so she and her sisters and all the women go off into the forest, and they're cavorting. And I mean, when they're cavorting, they're not just having fun. A goat herd sees them, or a cow herd, sorry, and they actually rip apart all the cattle in this frenzy. They're violent. They're violently lost in this kind of lack of control. So Pentheus knows something's awful, but he knows he can't do anything without the help of Dionysus. So Dionysus convinces him, right? Look, let's go. He says, I'm just going to ban them. And he said, okay, well, let's go, and why don't you look at them, see what they're up to? And of course, Pentheus is curious. He wants to know what these women do when they're up to these reveries. So Dionysus takes him to the place where Pentheus' own mother is going to be, in her state. And he climbs up a tree. Pentheus does, so he can get a better look. And in fact, it's Dionysus who suggests it to him. And he also says, look, get dressed as a woman so you can sort of, if they catch you, you can sort of, disappear. So he's dressed as a woman up on a tree. And as soon as women start the revelry, Dionysus says, hey, look up at the tree. There's a man staring at you. So he basically outs him. And the women climb the tree, drag him down, and start tearing him apart bit by bit. And his mother, by the way, who is in this reverie, can't recognize she is tearing the arm off her own son until they tear off his head. And the mother, this is now Agave, goes back to Thebes with the head of her own son screaming, we killed a lion. She thinks she's killed a lion. She's in that. And it's up to her own father to say, you're holding the head of your son. And in the play, the actual play, it is so powerful, that moment when she comes out of her reverie and looks at what she's holding. And it is her own son that she's actually carrying, the head of the son. It's extremely powerful. So why is the story Pluto? Well, it has a lot of the Pluto themes, right? It has order versus the need to control versus how incapable you are in a Pluto transit to control anything. It's like an overwhelming earthquake or tsunami. It comes in, you can't do anything about it. It has a sexual element, definitely. It also has this androgynous element of how the male and the female, it's not either, they're both, right? And so it's an element of you're trying to integrate, and you don't quite know how to do that. And so what's interesting is that in the idea that he put when he tells Pentheus to dress up as a woman, it's almost because he's being too much in the masculine. He's got too many rules. He needs to balance it out. And of course, because it is a revenge play, it never quite balances out. It's a fake balancing out. Anyway, so if anybody's interested in this, lots of great productions of this play, because it is so crazy. But I think it has all the Pluto myths or the Pluto words in it, the Pluto idea. Now, this book was written by Isabel Hickey. Isabel Hickey is an early astrologer from the turn of the century. And she's interesting because she would refuse to write about Pluto till about 1973, because she said, look, you need some time before you understand what Pluto's about. So let's look at remember we talked about when a planet is sighted, because it's always there. So when it's brought into consciousness, whatever's out in the world is really part of its signification. You sort of understand that it's reflecting the world. And this operates on an idea that Jung came up with in synchronicity, that the chart really represents that moment in time. It takes on the quality of that moment in time. So I'll let you tell me what 1930 and what are we looking at when Pluto is first sighted. Let's give me the general scenario. What's going on?
1930, the 1930s, but you could argue that 1930 itself, that was the U.S. in crisis with the collapse of the market. There was a worldwide recession. It wasn't just here. It infected everything. But you also see the rise of fascism during that decade. And fascism and Pluto go hand in hand. Pluto is a totalitarian symbol. It's an all-in. The thing about, you mentioned the myth, whatever else may be true about it, there is an intense, ultra-committed force in play. And then you get nuclear power, which is sort of the ultimate power that mankind has harnessed. Although you could also say it's the result of, math or, deep perception that makes possible harnessing, the energy of the sun. Literally, you're using the same forces. But then you also, it's really interesting, two other things that I can think of that are Plutonian, that at least this is my impression, correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot of the psychotherapy, psychiatry, a lot of that seemed to flourish in the 30s as well. And that's that side of the Plutonian going deep and discovering, like, what are these forces that are underneath? Because that's a quality of Pluto as well, that it's underground, it's submerged. And so there's that. And curiously, from the point of view of Pluto because if you link it to Scorpio, and it's the god of the underworld, so clearly it's connected to death. Scorpio is the natural death sign. And then you get vaccines emerge out of there as well, because they're taking death in little doses, which is a classic with Pluto as well. As soon as you talk nuclear power, you're harnessing the atom. So you're going to the smallest part of the universe and creating this big effect, right? So a vaccine is a Plutonian manipulation of that poison for good, for transforming that, right? And then you could even argue that, not right away, but I think Pluto probably leads to a total change in attitudes to sex, because, maybe not in the 1930s, but these planets, they come in and then they start to get into the manifest in the consciousness, and certainly by the 60s, by the 60s you had Pluto got together with Uranus, though. So if you want to get a combustible situation, put those two together, and no wonder the flower children and all that, and the radical effects that we had in the 60s. So all of those things are in play simultaneously. But yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying around the connection to Scorpio, because it definitely has a connection to that.
It definitely carries that thing. I'm glad you brought up depth psychology, because depth psychology is very much as what you're saying. And it's the idea of digging deep to find the patterns that are basically governing your reactions to things. And without knowing it, it's like a subterranean force that really actually can muck up your life in a very big way. So the knowledge doesn't necessarily mean that you can change everything, but you can certainly we talked about this before, you get a little space, right? So you're not reactive all the time. But the other things, absolutely. And I'm going to go back to the vaccine when we go through where Pluto's transit through all these signs, because I think you'll find that part really interesting from a historical point. Alan White, Chris Bennett never ceases to quote Alan White on Pluto, saying it makes the small things big and the big things small. And you just talked about one of those things, which is the atom. It's very small, obviously. It can it can absolutely harness the power of the sun and destroy everything, right? So that's anyway. These are some of the words I put up here that she identified already in the 70s, which is a much more psychological approach to Pluto, right? Which, by the way, if you think about it, the psychologists who were looking, a lot of the astrologers that emerged in the 70s and the 80s were psychologists. They were Jungians, a lot of them. And Pluto wasn't known in the classical world. So in fact, it is up to maybe moderns to understand it, because it is a new force that has only been understood in the modern world. Okay,
if I can say something really quickly, in that list you just had, if you put it back up.
Sure.
This is a classic where, something can be misinterpreted. So I've often thought that the greatest power of Pluto is in fact a concentrated willfulness. Yeah. You become, and I say this from my Pluto transits, especially two big ones that I've experienced, something arises to really galvanize and empower the will. Now, of course, if you then use that to go rob a bank or whatever, the way Trump uses, that's not a good idea, obviously. But willfulness is incredibly useful, because it's really concentrated force. It's like, this is the idea of something that appears to be small, because you've just got this focus and you keep doing it, and then something big happens as a result. So I would almost put willfulness on this side, provided you said it would be beneficial willfulness or harmonious willfulness.
Because it can be used both ways. An example of that through my Pluto-Mars transit, that's the only time I ever thought of training for
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I remember you.
Yeah. So my feet were bleeding, and it was like, I don't know why I'm compelled to try to train, but I couldn't stop.
Yeah, you right. Didn't you run a half marathon or something like that at that point?
I did, because I trained and I'd run a 40K run, and I got injured, and then I could only run the half marathon, but I was determined to run the marathon.
Yes.
And if you remember, in a typical Pluto Mars way, the reason I got injured is I refused to do it slowly. I went all in, which is going to be very Plutonian. And of course I got injured, and then my feet were but I did end up running the half marathon. But anyway, just
yes. That's exactly
a personal example, right? Of just being overtaken by that force, and it's willpower. I've never had that level of willpower. It was almost insanely focused on that one thing, because of course to do that, you also have to spend a lot of your life training. So totally, yeah. So that the will, meaning one of the things modern astrologers say is, that Pluto is almost like the higher octave of Mars. That's one of the things you hear, and that would be okay. Well, it's a Mars-ruled sign, Scorpio is, in the traditional pantheon. So it kind of makes sense that if you slot it in there, you're taking Mars and you're really amplifying it, correct. Way, even though it's a small way. Okay, so I want to go through the time, what's happened when Pluto has gone through different signs, because I think it'll give us an idea. And the reason we're having this conversation is I think the Pluto return is happening for the States, but there's a bigger thing on the horizon, which is Pluto is about to enter Aquarius in 2023 for the first time. And then it kind of goes back and forth. And then for sure in 2024, where it will stay for 20 years. And this is really big. I remember learning this from you years ago, Andre. Remember when the idea is that you watch a planet when it first ingresses into a sign, you sort of get a flavor. Do you remember when Uranus ingressed into Sagittarius in 1995? And it's, Sagittarius is about beliefs and people's extremely held beliefs. Didn't it coincide with the Oklahoma bombing? And I remember you saying, oh my God, this is a bad sign, because it was around that time anyway, that what you're talking about is the extremism of ideas because uniting with something as explosive as Uranus, and it turns into that. And we'll talk about it, because Pluto is also extreme obsession, and it radicalizes and transforms anything that it touches, right? You can't help it. And so let's start with Pluto entering into Gemini. And that happened, I believe, at around 1885. So what's Gemini? Well, Gemini is about community. It's ruled by Mercury. So we're talking about transportation, communication, all these modes that you can associate with. And one of the things I just checked, which I thought, so one of the first things I checked is I had an intuition, go back to the first newspaper published in the West, and that was in England in 1865. And sure enough, look at where Pluto was. Pluto is almost at the end of in retrograde in Gemini. And this is the last time that Pluto was in Gemini, the previous last time. So that would be
But that's 16. You said 18 is 1665.
Sorry, this is just 1665, because I went one cycle before that just to check. Right. Because, it's important to look, not to say, oh, it just happened this time. So the first actual newspaper, it starts in 1665. Then it gets, become more popular but the actual first newspaper, which is the Oxford Gazette.
Wow. Wow, that's impressive. That's impressive.
Now, here's 1885. The American Telephone and Telegraph Company is incorporated in 1885. Check the incorporation of AT&T. Again, Pluto, 0 degrees Gemini, had just entered. Right. It then gets reincorporated, by the way, I think in 1982. I have not checked that chart, but just to show you what's happening, because what's interesting is the telephone actually gets invented, I think, in the the first thing, and I think this is funny about how the symbolism works. I think it's 1877 or something like that. Pluto is still in Taurus, but what's interesting about it is the phonograph gets invented in 1877. And what's interesting about that one is that Pluto's in Taurus, and the first thing Edison does is records Mary had a little lamb. And Taurus is the sign of the voice because of the rulership through the throat. So you get the first recording through Pluto going through Taurus. And then through Gemini, you get the dissemination. Because Gemini, everybody has to have one. Of course, everyone didn't. But the other thing that happens between 1885 and 1914 is cars, flight, all things of transportation, right?
Gemini,
Total Gemini things, right? But the other thing is the telephones. People start having telephones. Again, not the masses, but you start seeing this becoming more and more common. So it's incredible that through its transforms, because remember, let's now unite the word Pluto with the signification of Gemini and the ruler. This is something I try to teach. Always remember the sign has a ruler, and Mercury right, is the ruler of Gemini. So then all Mercury things, all things related to communication between and transportation and things related to it are going to be transformed. And sure enough, they were completely transformed. There's no
By the way, even something as, I don't know if the word is poetic but really interesting correlation is Gemini and birds and flying. So literally people with often with Gemini connections, they're drawn to the idea of birds and flight and themselves. And so it's curious that this would be the possibly building on the Uranus discovery, which brings in technology, which makes because you probably know there's a sequence with you discover Pluto after you discover Uranus and Neptune, and you need electricity and you need the energies of Uranus and Neptune for Pluto to make it possible to then create airplanes. But it's a great correlation. Yes.
Right. And the other thing I would add here, because of and I think we can't do this in this session, but in a future session, we really have to talk about when two outer planets connect and there's new cycles, because I think that's extraordinary, but it would be way beyond what I can do here. But what's interesting about it is Gemini is also about talking, the talking cure. Psychoanalysis comes into being during this period as well, right? Because Freud starts publishing at the end of the 19th century, publishes his book on dreams. Then Jung is still doing his work at the Bergozzi in 1910, 1912. And then there's a big split with Freud around that period. But anyway, again, talking, communicating, all these things become really, really, and of course, AT&T is still one of the companies that is out there now, of course, united with the Uranian kind of spirit. I was going to say this because this is what I want to save more for the next talk. What happens also in 1891, 1892 is quite extraordinary. It's a 1 in a 500-year event, which is Pluto meets Neptune in 1891, 1892. And you get an enormous amount of people born in this period that we really have to have a separate thing, because if you just look quickly down this, it's Hitler, it's even though he's not mentioned here, it actually is Hitler, Franco, Goring, Mao Zedong, Ho Chi Minh. I mean, all of these, actually Stalin a couple of years before. But anyway, the point is the amount of people with power who are power obsessed. Well, Eisenhower as well here too, and the amount of artists that are born here. But we'll go back to it just to show you how important these cycles are. Where two planets, two outer planets actually.
Pluto Neptune, right.
Okay, that we'll talk about that in a later one. Now, Pluto going into Cancer happens in 1914. What is the big event that happens almost as soon as it enters? Well, the First World War, right? And what's really interesting in researching this, I mean, the Cancer, of course, is ruled by the moon. So it's about home. Home taken to an extreme level is nationalism. And one of the things you saw with the First World War is just this incredible fervor, nationalistic fervor that really fueled a lot of what went down there. And what's really sad about it is there's so many great books about the First World War because it was supposed to be the war that ended all wars. And in fact, it was just a total tragedy. And one of the reasons is when the mother sent off their boys to fight, right? They're supposed to be back very soon. All this is going to be done by Christmas. And in fact, you found a 4-year war of attrition where just young boys were basically sacrificed on the field. One I've just sent out shot. Another group, there's a lot to be said about the classes of people that were doing that, sending out young men while they stood behind and watched this happen. It was total carnage. And so a lot of the songs from the period when 1914 entered, around this period where as soon as the war was not resolving, was about bring my boy home. The word home becomes really important because people just want to go back to a time when things aren't as insane as they were for the time especially in the beginning. Interesting that in 1914, I think the war starts with 2 degrees. I think Pluto's at 2 degrees Cancer, and the United States only joins in 1917. And what's weird is Pluto is again at the 2 degree Cancer point, because as you know, the planet moves back and forth. And so it again is there. The other big thing that happens, of course, in this sense is the suffragette movement and women getting the vote. Although I had to laugh because I am such a fan of Jung, realizing that Switzerland did not grant the women the vote till 1971 is quite amazing. And in fact, in some areas of Switzerland, it was like in the 1990s. So that's kind of interesting.
Wow, really?
In the average, the rest of the world, I think the earliest were the colonies, New Zealand and Australia. They were much more progressive. But then if you think about all these other places, Canada 1917, US 1920. I should say 1920 for white women, because there's always, groups of women are still excluded because of the nature, the color of their skin, which is outrageous, but that's the way it was. And you're just looking across, it's just a massive wave of women that finally get the rights to vote. And of course, Cancer is ruled by the moon. It is women in every sense of the word. So it is one of the big issues that comes up. The other thing is Pluto doesn't actually leave Cancer. Oh, and another thing that happens, and this is to the point of cardinality. Do you remember that thing that was done, that documentary about the pandemic and the idea that Pluto was in a cardinal sign? And cardinal literally means hinge. When things really change, they pivot. They're really powerful points in the chart, right? Cancer is a cardinal sign. And it's interesting that the 1918 flu happened again in a cardinal sign, where things can really, really massively turn and become crazy, which is what it was, just given how many people it wiped out. And what's interesting about that too is that just not the rapidity, because it was over 2 years, but just how much. It was just such an incredible thing that took over. Okay, so this is, of course, just scenes from the First World War, just how crazy the whole thing was. All right, in 1939, one thing on Pluto, that's the thought I was going to, and then I got my mind just went somewhere else. The Great Depression was about not being able to feed people. And again, the moon is very much to do with feeding. And Pluto doesn't leave till 1939. That whole Great Depression period is part of that Pluto and Cancer story, right? You can't actually feed, people are starving. And so it's the whole 1930s is dark in a way that very few eras have been. All right, then Pluto moves into Leo just as the Second World War starts in Leo. And what's interesting about Pluto's ingress into Leo is that think about how different. Can you tell me the names of any of the generals or any of the big players in the First World War off the top of your head?
No.
Yeah. Can you tell me the players in the Second World War off the top of your head?
A little more. Not at the moment. It's not popping in, but they're more well known. I know that those.
Okay. So who is the German? Everybody knows the German, right? Who's at the head? The German.
Oh, I can't remember that off the top of my head, but yeah.
You can't. You're having a mental moment. Hitler, of course.
Hitler. Oh no, Hitler. Yeah, no, okay. Well, Hitler.
Oh, you were yeah. General. No, I'm not asking.
No, but yeah, those. Now, mind you, that's also because it's also more recent. So in a certain way,
right. But it also speaks to Leo. Right, Leo it's about the big guy, right? It's not about the country anymore. It's not about Cancer. About the country is going to regret. Now we're talking about Benito Mussolini, Italy, Franco in Spain, who's just basically thumped Spain, Stalin in Russia, FDR in the U.S., and of course Hitler in Germany. It was really, and of course Churchill in England. These are all huge because their personalities. It was almost like a larger own life, and that's a very Leo kind of thing, right? That's one of the archetypes, and here they are. Here's Mussolini and Hitler, and they're the two, FDR and Churchill and Stalin. And also the other thing is it's a very different type of war, right? It's very different. And how does it end, by the way? It ends with an atom bomb going off, which is the sun, Leo, ruling the sun. You harness the power of the sun, and then you blow it up. It's crazy. Franco, for those who don't know Franco, there's probably one who has. Now, I want to talk about another thing that happens in 1939, which James Bacchae brought up, which I thought was so interesting. This is known as the great year in cinema, right? Because in 1939, these 5 incredible films come out at the same time. Gone with the Wind, Stagecoach, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Of Mice and Men, and then, of course, The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz is funny because it even has a lion in it. So it's like, yes, it's a perfect representation. Right. But it also speaks to the other side of Leo, which is incredible creative power, right? Leo is creative beyond. So you have this incredible output. And Bacchae, who is a Vedic / Western astrologer, he actually merges both things, which is kind of interesting, says that when sidereal Pluto gets to Leo, which is later, 1954, he said something happened as well, in that On the Waterfront was made, and it changed acting. Like prior to that, acting had been really stilted and really sort of fake theater type of that was more appropriate to a theater than to film. It changes because of Marlon Brando's. So I just thought that was interesting that it has the creative side of it as well. So then Pluto enters Virgo in 1958, late 1958, and stays there, I think, till about 1972 or so. The complicating factor here with Pluto in Virgo, ruled again by Mercury, so we're back to a Mercury sign, right? is that it also had Uranus in the 60s. So we had the coming together of two planets that only meet every more than 100 years, 140, I think it is. So this is why it needs another talk, right? But in Virgo, what would you expect things to come up, because it's a Virgo, what kind of issues would you expect to come up with?
Well, the Pluto and Virgo, one of the things is the Pluto and Virgo generation is the generation that subsidizes the supplement industry and the health industry, and they're the people that are they're constantly wondering, am I about to die? Like, do I need to take more vitamin D? Or it's just like because Pluto. See, part of the thing with Pluto too is what you said earlier about the obsession, the ultra focus. So that's something that is an overwhelming force, for good or for not so good, and figuring out what to do with it can be quite a challenge. And so then you could expect to get, for example, massive hypochondriacs in this group, but you also are going to get big advances in that area as well, because that's the sign. So both. Oh, and the computing too. Computers.
Yes.
Because Virgo and Gemini and all the data analysis would be Mercury and Virgo, right?
Right. Perfect. Right. So you've got it. First of all, you've got also the environmental movement, Silent Spring.
Yes.
Published in 1963, I believe, by Rachel Carson, which really brings to the foreground for the first time the idea that, although I have to say, Jung was talking about it already a lot before this, but anyway, it becomes popularized, the idea that the climate is suffering and we need to pay attention to it. The computers, a whole bunch of things get invented around this period, including a chip that will be used from then on, and not only mainframe computers, but eventually in personal computers. So you get the first explosion of the computer. You also get Medicare, and Medicaid gets introduced by Johnson in 1965 with Pluto and Virgo, right?
Right.
In Canada, we get Medicare for all, I guess our version, healthcare for all, in the 1960s as well. There you see our guys signing that, which is much more expansive than your version. But anyway, both these things were obviously front and center at that time. So all of these things are there. Okay, so then we move to Pluto in Libra, ruled by Venus. So we're back to a little bit to the stories about women. Now, you notice now we're talking about 1972 to 1984. Already we're in Libra. It's a very fast move through Libra, 12 years, right? So one of the things that I just learned by walking around with the dog and listening to a podcast is I was listening to the mythological import of Wonder Woman. And Wonder Woman actually shows up as a heroine, right? As a female heroine, which you don't really see in this period. She's a Venus heroine. She comes out and she has a different value system than the masculine heroes have, and that she does more it's more of a taking care of idea than here I am and I'm going to save the world, me, the individual. But it's funny that it would come out in Pluto and Venus. But a whole bunch of things that happen in under Venus is, first of all these diet books show up. And I think that speaks to Venus, la bella figura, the idea that you have to look a certain way, and therefore we must all diet until we're okay. And then a whole bunch on, of course, marriage. The divorce rate skyrockets around the 1970s. There's a huge reevaluation of relationship, right? Because it's Venus, and Libra, and Libra is the sign of relationship. And of course, you have the Equal Rights Amendment in the United States. And then you have a lot of pop psychology. I'm okay, you're okay.
I like that. That's so Libran, to say I'm okay, you're okay. That's a classic Libra statement.
I know. It's when I saw that it was published under the spirit, I thought that's so incredible. And the other thing is about the communication across relationships. So look at this book by Margaret Mead. She's a well-known anthropologist who publishes this book, The New Relationships Between the Generations. So it's not even relationships between men and women, and of course gay rights become a bigger issue at this time. It's also even across generations. We want to have a dialogue and talk and relate in a better way. So this is all Pluto and Libra stuff that happens.
And the diet revolution, that I would also say is interpreting what one cycle builds on another. So it goes through Virgo. Yes. You're in a sense conditioning the population to think food, agriculture, all that organic stuff probably started to come out a little bit. And so then it's a natural thing, goes into Libra, and you borrow from that and you incorporate it, and you start writing more about beauty and self-image and all that.
Yes, and health too. I mean, obviously health, but it was really because you have to make. And already we were seeing by the 1970s the consequences of a processed food diet, and it was affecting people's health and people's also weight. Right? Okay, so then Pluto moves into Scorpio. Now I can remember this period pretty well. I'm sure you can as well because it enters about 1984, and it goes mercifully only till 1995. I mean, this is the shortest. Pluto will only spend 11 years in Scorpio. And it really correlates very much to the AIDS epidemic at the time. And I mean, I know of two people. One I knew personally, one was the son of someone I knew who died of AIDS. It was a really tragic time. And by the way, for all those people who love to have great conspiracy theories, our own brother-in-law was working on this at Cornell when he was doing his PhD. And I remember asking him about this in the late 80s. And he said, no, it won't be solved. This is way too difficult, but there will be therapeutics that will help. And in fact, that's what's happened with AIDS. The revolution has been in being able to give people drugs that allow them to live with it, that it doesn't kill them. And I think today it's easy to forget how much damage. And by the way, it's still the damage is being done in the developing world. We just don't pay attention. But the fact is that these drugs were miraculous, but it would really condition the period that we're talking about. A whole bunch of other things too. The day after, do you remember that film? It was shown in the early 80s and we all woke up the next day feeling like we were all going to be blown up.
Oh,
that's what. Yeah, the day after was called. It was a kind of a sort of kind of half documentary, half story, but it was really reflecting just how tense it felt. The United States under Reagan was, pushing the USSR, who at that time were falling apart, but, so they were pushing back. And it's a little bit like Putin today with his war games because he knows the whole thing is collapsing. So it was a horrible time. You really felt tension in the air. A couple of other things. The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood gets published in 1985. We're seeing now the Handmaid's Tale being enacted in the kind of repressive stuff that's going on in the States, but she already conceptualized the idea of women's reproductive rights under Scorpio, which represents the reproductive organs being controlled by men. Mars, the other ruler of Scorpio. This was conceptualized then and brought to life then. The other thing that jumped out at me, the first vampire story in the Anne Rice series that is just enormously popular. I mean, it was later made into a film, but I mean, it sold hundreds of millions. I think it might have sold 100 million copies in total. That first vampire book, love story. Now think about Scorpio, blood, obsession, and you get Scorpio. The whole story. And finally, I thought this was pretty crazy. Salman Rushdie publishes the Satanic Verses in 1987, and a fatwa is declared against him. He's basically threatened Pluto with death for daring to publish such a book. So they had this really intense period of time that have all these different motifs. So I guess now we're in 1995, Pluto enters. Is it 95? 95. It enters. Is it 95? Okay, it enters Sagittarius. And of course, Sagittarius is the sign of religion, philosophies, deeply held beliefs, expansive beliefs as well, too. And some of the things that came up then, I mean, tragically, first of all the religions are really highlighted, and people are doing a lot of reinterpretations of religions at that time, right? But there's also the extreme nature of some beliefs. Like Alex Jones' Infowars begins during this time, and he's only one of the many clowns who comes out and tries to convince people of these incredibly health beliefs that also play on people's fears, right? The Wikipedia, if you think about knowledge being codified, Patrick Watson pointed this out, codified in a way that is made accessible. That's the Wikipedia gets founded at the same time. And of course, the extreme stuff that is aligned with beliefs is 9/11 and the subsequent wars that are waged post 9/11, all on the basis of just extremely held notions. I think I didn't look at this deeply, but I think probably this is where fundamentalist Christians also expand and grow their strength, because fundamentalism just with Pluto, again, it's that obsessive quality. This is the only way. And I can't just believe it for me. I have to convince you that my God is right, and I will, do anything, including deprive you of rights and of your life. This sounds crazy. On the other hand, you see things like the initiatives between the neuroscientists and Buddhism. The Dalai Lama actually organized this to get the Buddhists to talk to they to talk to the neuroscientists to see where they converged, because the Dalai Lama had this theory that, look, whatever neuroscience is coming up with right now, we've already gleaned through insight meditation. And so we want to talk to them to see if this is true. And what I loved about the Dalai Lama is he said, if neuroscientists tell me that something we believe doesn't coincide, I'm going to believe the neuroscientists. He was very open about this. Of course, it didn't, because a lot of these insights are actually very much.
They're, I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe that probably happened with Pluto in Sagittarius, but Neptune and Uranus went into Aquarius,
right.
Which
yes.
Aquarius is going to bring in the scientism, it's an air sign and it's a lot more data driven than, say, if something is in Pisces, you just say, well, I just believe it, I feel it, whatever. Yeah. Aquarius will want to measure. So yeah, probably right. That's what happened as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why you can't really look at one planet. It just, you more look at the general tenor of what is being transformed, what is being showcased, so you can transform it, but then you need other.
Well, I mean, Pluto in Sagittarius, my impression of that period is that culminating in 9/11, there was this awareness of the international global nature of the planet and how, these radicals could go in and fly planes, into a building and totally upend the world order. And so it's the idea of international terrorism too, because that caused a tremendous pullback in terms of security. Ever since then, we got to take off our shoes, and it's become this thing. It left its imprint on the idea that you've got the entire planet as opposed to just one thing, and all based on some belief, because their attitude is, your system is corrupt, our system, whatever it is better, and you shouldn't be doing what you're doing. And so you're fighting over beliefs, basically.
Yeah, which is, of course, the Sagittarius word, right?
Yes.
All right, so then we all remember this. Pluto enters Capricorn in 2008. What's the first thing that happens? Tell me, Andre, what happens right as soon as Pluto enters Capricorn?
Well, for one thing, Barack Obama was elected.
Big change in the way, power. So Saturn rules Capricorn, and Saturn is all about power structures, and it's all about things like banks, which will give you the clue as to what happened.
Oh, yes. Well, yeah, that was the collapse. Yeah, by the way, that was an example of, remember that argument we used to get into, go back enough years, and there was that astrologer floating around who kept insisting that the U.S. is really Scorpio rising because he kept pointing.
He's still there.
Yeah, well, he kept pointing to the. He would bring up the $2 bill. No, not the $2 bill. There's no $2 bill in the U.S. The $1 bill, whatever it was that he said. Oh, it says 2:10 p.m. and that was the story. And he kept saying, well, the proof is that look how the economy. There was no economic problem at all until Pluto entered Capricorn, which is the second sign from the ascendant, which is the place of where you get an economic collapse, which is exactly what happened, right? So the Pluto entered the U.S. second sign and correlated immediately with a huge problem. Where in the banking system, because all the planets are on the opposite side. So that was just an aside,
No, that's a very important. I've never understood. Also, I think to the point of the Scorpio rising, I am outside of the U.S. and can tell you that the ascendant is the way that you show to the world, right? There's no way, and if you know enough about astrology, there is no way that anybody perceives an American persona as Scorpio. Americans go out into the world with, hey, I'm here. It's a very fiery, positive. Scorpio would be
cowboy hats, right?
Yeah, cowboy hats. That's exactly. It's ridiculous, right? Okay, so some of the things, the banks, of course, collapsed in 2008, specifically the United States, which I think speaks to that second house story, because it didn't happen in Canada because we had greater controls, but it still affected us. The whole economy went to pot, because when you guys sneeze, everybody gets a cold, as they say. Right. So, of course, you had this changing, the idea of hope, because you had a new power structure represented by a hopeful person in Obama. And then you had the reaction at the same time within that period, the founding of the Tea Party down here. And, of course, the eventual election of the person who shall not be named, and Putin. All of these are Capricorn kind of figures in that they represent Saturn, the need for control, the need to, and of course, who only benefit themselves. This is the dark shadow side of that.
Well, don't forget Plutonian figures as well, because really, when you look at Putin and Trump, they're showing you a lot more Pluto than Saturn, because Saturn, in a way, there's a way in which you could even argue Obama was the Saturn, because he was actually an orderly, administrative person. These two guys, they're thugs. Their attitude is, if I just have a big enough weapon, it should be enough that people would follow me based on my weapon or my personality just because I say so. That's classic Plutonian. Yeah.
Right. So. Well, and I would say that you're dead on, because that is the application of Pluto, the ruthlessness of Pluto to Capricorn, which is about the power structure. So you really get the extreme Pluto. And by the way, I have these two guys here, but let's not forget Orban in Hungary, Bolsonaro in Brazil. This is not, and the behavior, there's just so many of them that you don't know where to start. The Philippines, China, I mean, where are you going to go, right? Oh, and even, go ahead.
No, just really quickly, notice too that, that's correct, that it's been not just the US, I mean, it's but notice that, going back to what you said earlier, Pluto in Cancer and the idea that that's the motherland, and that led to the rise of fascism. Cancer and Capricorn, that's when you get these problems in the biggest way, because you're talking about the homeland, issues of intense personal security and government. And so that axis, when Pluto goes through there, it's particularly dangerous around big turmoil in what all of that means. So back in the 30s, because then back in the 30s, Pluto was what led to the actual, most of the killing happened in Leo in the Second World War, but really it was the Cancer period that set that off, and now Capricorn. Now, hopefully we're not going to have that in Aquarius following Capricorn, but certainly it's why it's been so topsy-turvy, during these years. Yeah.
And the structures are being reanalyzed. I mean, we are talking about the structures that we have, right? We are talking, does this work? Some conversations are evolving from that. So it's not all, Saturn is a discipline, as you say. Obama was Aquarius rising, ruled by Saturn. He is a more Saturnian, but when you couple it with Pluto, I think you've got these extremes that come out that are really scary. And of course, we've got the pandemic that is a Pluto Saturn story, Pluto Capricorn story. But I think I go to the angularity again, the fact that the nodes were involved in Saturn. There were so many things that came together in this weird historical way that hopefully won't happen again for a while. Let's go to Pluto and Aquarius, though, because that's the one that we really want to talk about. And of course, I have to go back to the last time Pluto was in Aquarius. And some of the things you said earlier might intrigue you. So this actually is where I did my undergraduate thesis on, because it was during this happened during the French Revolution. And of course, we know that Uranus was sighted, right? So 1777, I think, is when Uranus enters Aquarius, and it stays for 20 years. So it's just right after the United States declares independence, 1776. But the war doesn't end for the United States. They continue fighting till 1783. So there is a revolutionary fervor, which won't surprise you, because Aquarius is a people, right? The U.S. moon in Aquarius represents the people. And so they are not going to put up with it. And so you have the French Revolution, you have the American Revolution, you have the Industrial Revolution in the background, also trying to liberate people from misery and early death because they can't feed themselves properly. But then, and a couple of other things that are really quite interesting over here is Lavoisier, who actually is able to, he's a chemist who actually gives you the composition of air. And I think that's kind of funny because, of course, Aquarius is the ultimate air sign, one of the air signs, the last air sign, Gemini, Libra, Aquarius. The other thing, you mentioned this before, and so this might give us all a little bit of hope. The Jenner smallpox vaccine shows up in this period, right? He develops it in this period. So Aquarius is always about the thinker that thinks outside of the box. So you think about people who have strong Aquarian signatures, like James Joyce. He doesn't write like everybody else. They're thinkers that are way ahead of their time. And Jenner was like that. I mean, and there was a huge pushback, because you can imagine someone saying, I'm going to now introduce into your child some cowpox, but it saved people's lives. And that was really the beginning of vaccination. So if you think about Pluto being involved with vaccines in Aquarius, an air sign, I'm wondering if that will create some new medicine, some new way of approaching these issues that we haven't thought about before. Just the thought, right? Because
for sure. I mean, the thing is, even if you don't necessarily point to vaccines, but Pluto, the next many years, I bet, would be an explosion in scientific knowledge, and maybe many of these things that they're studying around maybe lengthening life, or different ways to tune the body. Like, for example, there's been this drive where with cancer treatments, they're more and more targeted so that they're not as invasive to the body and so forth. So I would expect that to progress and improve over the next many years. And then the other thing would be that the Aquarian side, as you bring up, these revolutions where presumably they're for the people. And this is why I've repeated a number of times in my videos that, to me, that gives me hope, in that the Capricorn period is suitable for fascists like Trump and Putin and even people like Bolsonaro, the Orban, etc. Aquarius is much, much less fertile because you're getting into the group. Right. In other words, when you think of Aquarius, you think democracy, because it's the idea. Notice too that Uranus is a very how do I say this? It's a paradoxical symbol in that the feeling of Uranus when it's around is it makes you very independent, and yet it rules a group-oriented sign. So it's the idea of the individual, because democracy is the group, but you're also empowering the individual. That's the whole point of democracy, right? Yeah. So both of those come together, and Pluto being there, to me, the biggest danger that I can see is that it would empower corporations too much, even more than they already are, because they're also groups. But other than that, it's much better than Capricorn.
Can I give you the shadow side just from history, which is a really dark shadow side? So we all have to be on guard for this, because I think, yes, it was a revolutionary period. It changed, brought in democracies, as flawed as they were. There were different ways of organizing governments. Let me use the French Revolution as the shadow side. So you start with the revolution, storming the Bastille. You don't have bread. I'm tired of this. The king must die. The king is basically deposed. By 1792, the Committee of Public Safety is created. And you're talking now a bunch of extreme radicals take over, right? And this is going to make you laugh, because some of the symbolism is too much. They decide not only are they going to get rid of the king, they're going to invent a new calendar, because the old calendar, this is how radical, and it really speaks to the Uranian nature of Aquarius, right? They decide that they're going to create their own calendar, their own way of keeping time, so they can get rid of all royalist and church references whatsoever, which of course is incredibly ridiculous, because France is living surrounded by other countries that have a different calendar. But I think the symbol that really speaks to it is they go into the Cathedral of Notre Dame and they put in a statue for the goddess Reason. And there is a shadow side to reason, right? If you only have reason, you have extreme. And of course, that's exactly what happened here. They started guillotining everybody that didn't agree with them. And so groups, and this is the problem with group power, just because the people aren't necessarily always right, or you'd have to give the January 6 hooligans the authority to enter and overturn an election, right? So I think we should all be on guard with shadow side issues that could come out with Aquarius, which means, yes, we're groups, but we can't divorce ourselves from each other so much that one group decides this is the only way, right? So I think the big battle, honestly, going in the next 20 years is how do we manage group interests versus an individual? Because remember, you always have the polarity. So when you bring in Aquarius, you bring in Leo, you bring in the individual. Well, yeah, your rights versus my as an individual. So I think, on the one hand, I think I agree with you. There will be great technological strides, because they happened already in the late 18th century. The kind of things that started happening that revolutionized not only the way we did things, but the fact that there was a huge population explosion because you could actually start feeding people. And then, of course, led to the factories and led to more worldwide travel. Every sign has a shadow side. And I think the shadow side that we should all be aware of is the bullying of one group to the other group.
Yeah, that's very true. And by the way, you can even see this, for example, in the current scenario. It's pretty easy to say, well, look, I mean, the MAGA crowd is wrong. They're insane. And so the remaining group is right, but not always, because then what ends up happening is you can, for instance, push something too far where, case in point, there was you remember this thing with the Biden's, the $6 trillion plan. In retrospect now, was probably a really bad idea, because that would have made inflation even much, much worse. And it's a case where you just become so convinced of a certain way of doing things that it may not be true, and you have to be able to give way a little bit. But this kind of thing tends to be extremely hard when sides are polarized, because then you start getting into wins and losses and all this kind of insanity instead of cooperating. Aquarius is the idea at its height: cooperate and come up with the best solution. It's just that it's a little difficult, let's say, at the moment, right, to do that. So
yeah. So I mean, so this is where we're at now. I've gone through the Pluto ingresses through all the the 248 cycle. But I think on a future thing, which would, go beyond this, is it's really, really important to look at the other thing, which is what happens when two outer planets meet and initiate a cycle. So Pluto Neptune, 1891, initiating a 500-year cycle, which we're now into it. And just to show people that it's not just the conjunction, you have to track the whole thing as it goes through, right? Because the issues that surge in 1891 will keep on surfacing in different ways. So too with the Uranus-Pluto, the Neptune, it's good to look at cycles within cycles. And of course, cycles is my favorite word. So I could look at them all the time because it allows me to look at the historical record, which I really find fascinating. So there it is, though. This is Pluto. I don't think any planet going into any sign is a solution to anything. I think we always have to watch our backs and make sure that we capitalize on the positive qualities, yes, but be very aware that the shadow side is there and that problems they never get fully solved. Other things will surge, but we'll see how they look.
Yeah, well, I mean, the only thing I'd say to cap it off in terms of giving everyone some sense of the likelihood of things becoming a little less crazy over the next while, because of the multiple cycles, Pluto being one, entering Aquarius, Neptune switching signs out of Pisces.
Right.
And this idea that you see repeated, the Saturn cycle when it goes through Aquarius, Pisces, and Aries, you can go back more than 100 years. It keeps repeating with, it correlates with progressive periods where the government in charge represents democracy, and the other side tends to want to not do that. And the thing is, we're in that now, and so then I see Pluto going into Aquarius as representing the possibility that this madness that is being currently transacted in the States, where this is totally crazy. Including this latest thing where the Supreme Court is taking up a case to potentially say that the legislatures can just put it out of their, decide we don't care what the people vote is, we'll just put in our own vote. Right. That's contrary to Pluto and Aquarius. It makes zero sense to me. If anything, I would expect a strengthening of the power of the people to express their view. That's how I would see Pluto and Aquarius, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think what we should all do, maybe you will watch it and you'll probably do a video at the time, is just watch the first moment it ingresses into Aquarius and see what is going on, just to look around. Because I think it often tells you what flavor. If you look back at all the cases I showed, it's that first year that it enters. Like think about Pluto entered Cancer in 1914, First World War, 1939, boom. You get the boom, the Second World War. There's almost, as it ingresses, you get an idea of what this is going to be like. And so, we'll watch. But I agree, the people have got to be empowered. I can see another storming of the Bastille type energy that can happen in the United States.
Well,
pressure,
Right, although you see that if someone is being more pessimistic, they say, well, wouldn't that be, especially if we think of the MAGA people, they, in their mind, they're the ones that would do the storming because they feel like they are not being heard. The problem is that that's not really representative of the people, because the people is the larger group. That's the whole point. That you can't have a minority. Yeah. In other words, the minority here is trying to abduct and say, no, that's us. But it's not. You guys are the minority here. So that would be.
And I would just, point out that in the French Revolution, it was the minority led by intellectuals so the majority led by intellectuals, which are the minority. And I think that's what always happens too. And why? Because Aquarius, the opposite again is Leo. These groups will never go on their own. They will also have leaders. They will choose charismatic leaders that will push them forward, right? And so, we think he's horrible, but these people have taken the charismatic leader idea and posted it or projected it onto Trump. So to a certain degree, you're going to have a countervailing force that isn't as degenerate as he is. And we'll see what, but it's always absolutely right. The majority group here is the one that would rise up, because it is the people in a larger
That's
sense.
right. Otherwise it would be sort of the opposite. Yeah. You'd almost expect, when you think about it, Pluto reaches the height of imbuing fear into the collective when it's in the middle of Capricorn. That's when Trump comes in. The planet is entrenched in this location, and then it starts to make its way through. We have to all experience it and so forth. But now it's on its way out, and concurrent, by the way, with the 2024 elections, which makes it particularly interesting around.
It will be very interesting for sure.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's the story for today. We'll do the cycles in a future thing because I think they're really fascinating just to see what comes out of that. But
all right, that was a lot of fun, and I look forward to the next one. All right.
All right. See you later.